Just as a reminder, you can visit us at thoughtsexpanded.com. That's thoughtsexpanded.com to sign up for our amazing Patreon exclusives, listen directly, and share our latest episodes with your family and friends. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Panda Pod. I am Rab, and I'm joined here by the usual suspects, Wiggy.
Hello.
And Jeff.
What up?
And so today we have a history episode for you, but I guess before we get there, I guess this is going to be a little bit delayed. Why don't we just give short reactions to the debate that just happened?
Oh, no. So the first 2024 presidential debate happened just a couple days ago when we're recording. Yeah, it was grim. It was hard to watch.
Yeah.
Is that all you have on that?
I mean, we got a lot more. I just wanted to give you guys a
do
chance.
a whole episode on it if we wanted to. But I mean, the thing is that by the time we release it, it's going to be late anyways.
Sure.
So why not?
Yeah.
Why don't we just do that after the next debate or something?
Yeah. I mean, this episode will probably be coming out shortly after the DMC, with the DMC, like the conference, like where they're going to go and choose who's being picked. So, I saw a mostly brain dead and very tired President Biden, and it got me real worried. Not because I'm worried about his health or anything to do with him being okay, but because it made Trump look competent in comparison, even though he was spouting nothing but fake numbers and lies the entire time. And that alone is probably going to swing some votes in his favor, and that's scary. It's just frightening, you know.
For me, apologize for the yawning. So for me,
the yawning is just
nothing.
You're role playing Biden.
Yeah, I'm role playing Biden. Nothing changed. Like, it was just a confirmation of everything that we knew was already happening. Like, it was, they forgot to give Biden his vitamin injections, and so he couldn't do anything. He couldn't speak well. He couldn't think well. He was jumping around, which we knew was the case. And the entire time that Trump was up on stage, it was, they fed a lot of questions about his felony convictions and things like that. And it was him the entire time just trying to say that he was wrongly convicted, and that it's the same old witch hunt, and that there's nothing wrong. He never did anything wrong. And and him trying to convince the world that he doesn't need to go to jail and that he hasn't ever done anything else wrong and they shouldn't go looking for it.
Right.
And so that's all it was just the opportunity for both of them to show the worst sides of themselves, which they did. I watched like 5 minutes of like the tail end of RFK Jr.'s like side by side that he did. And I think they put that together well. They gave him a time limit, all of other kinds of stuff. But I didn't see enough of it to actually make an opinion on it. But
sure,
something that I will say, and something that we talked about a little bit, just was it yesterday or the day before, was that he came out and publicly said that if they wanted to not run Biden, that they could run him instead, which goes against everything that he's fucking ran on the entire time. And then he sends out emails the day later saying that the FCC deadline's coming up because it's the end of the month, and that we should donate if we want to support the third party and break the system.
Sure.
So it's like, okay, bro, like I don't even believe you anymore now. Not that I really had a hope in the first place, but like at least you showed your colors. Like, so it's all just a bunch of bullshit. There is no hope. Which is what I've been saying for the past like 3 fucking months anyway. So nothing changed.
Well, at least with this episode, we can bring you the story of a time when people did look around at the circumstances that they were in and decide to change some things. And that's part of the reason I wanted to talk about it with everything we've been talking about. What I was actually hoping to do is that we were going to go through the recap, the short recap of the debate, and I was going to get to use the transition. Speaking of dying in office, why don't we talk about FDR today?
Well, that's what happens when you take 3 terms, right?
Yeah, well, he had 4. He was elected 4 times.
4 times.
Yep.
Can't do that anymore.
Why don't we straight get into it? I mean, you legally can't do it because they changed the laws after he did that. So I figured when talking about FDR, it makes sense to front load like the one thing that he did that was definitely a war crime and seriously bad. Like, just go ahead and put that up front. I mean, there may be multiple things that he did that could be considered wrong or bad, but this is probably the glaring one that everybody points to. And that's that, in 1941, December 1941, it started in February 1942, after Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. FDR forcibly relocated 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, more than 2/3 of which were native-born American citizens, and forced them to move inland to effectively concentration camps.
Not cool. Not cool, FDR. It's kind of a dick move.
That was a gigantic dick move. And if you want to learn a lot about that, George Takei has a lot of publicly available information where he spoke on that ad nauseum. So
yeah, okay, that's a good source. Yeah, so I mean, I bring that up mostly because it's unequivocally bad, and it's also something that you can make the decision yourself whether you think that the good outweighs the bad with this guy. I mean, I could see there being arguments either way. I would say the vast majority of U.S. presidents, it's pretty easy to see that the bad outweighs the good. It's possible with FDR the good outweighs the bad. My personal opinion is that it might, kind of leaning towards yes, but I also, you, the listener, can make up your own mind about that.
Well, in a lot of ways, I feel like a listener in this episode because I just don't know a lot about FDR. So coming into this, I'm going to say that I don't like him at the moment for this internment camp stuff. You're going to have to convince me otherwise.
Another Teach Jeff history moment.
Yep. Welcome to Teach Jeff history. And I'll go through a brief timeline here. And I guess let me see if I can fiddle with, sorry, we'll cut this out, but I'm fiddling with it so I can see you guys' faces at the same time.
Also at the same time, I'm gonna say a whole bunch of shit, but get a whole bunch of timelines wrong. Because that's how I understand this.
Sure.
This era is by
okay.
I know what happened, but I don't know when the fuck it happened.
Sure.
Especially relative to other things. So.
All right. Well, back to it. So to give kind of a timeline. You guys just cut me off whenever you have something interesting to say about any of this stuff. The FDR was first elected to New York State Senate in 1911, so that was pre-World War I. And he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. So pretty much for the whole of World War I, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So, I mean, he had stuff to do related to the war, right? Not a veteran. He's not that. I mean, I don't think you have to have a military rank to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I think that's more like a cabinet position.
Yeah, it's appointed cabinet type thing.
Exactly. And in 1920, he was the vice president on a ticket, but lost. So that they did not win. 1921 is when he contracted the paralytic illness. Most people believe that it's polio. And when I say most people, I mean the vast majority of people who know about FDR believe it's polio. It seems like there's recent debate, scholarly debate, about whether that's actually true or not. Mostly because it was generally the case that polio didn't affect like older people. It was mostly a disease that kids got. And so people think that maybe like he had Guillain-Barre's disease or something like that. But it's regardless, it's the case that he got a paralytic illness that caused him to lose both of his legs. And effectively, I mean, not lose, they weren't cut off. He had the legs on him.
But to say like you just hopped off FDR's legs, bro.
No,
right out from underneath him before he even.
No, he had the legs, and actually, he commonly would hide the fact that he had a disability. Right? He would actually come out to do speeches and stuff, like where he would walk out using crutches, or he'd have two people supporting him, and then he basically just lean on the podium the whole time, and it didn't matter that his legs didn't work. So that was a common thing for him. So, and actually, to that point, when I was doing the research, I found it interesting that disability advocates actually have different opinions on whether or not FDR was I mean, obviously he's the first and only disabled president, but he's...
I would debate that.
Okay.
I'd strongly debate that.
Well, do you think there was one after him or before him?
Definitely after.
Okay, so you're thinking like maybe like you're talking about like
we're talking physical disability. Yeah, not a physical disability.
I'm also talking physical disability.
Who?
For sure, physical disability. Yeah.
Who?
Clinton.
What did Clinton have though?
Yeah. He could only get it up if there were young women around him. Like. That's a disability to me. Like,
okay,
wow, okay, yeah. I guess that that kind of it makes me feel bad.
I mean, MC, come on, like, ED. I mean, I guess it's not ED. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a dysfunction. I think that's different than a disability.
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Also, we'll leave that up to. History to decide.
Most people consider FDR, I think, to be the first and only disabled president. But the question that I was saying that's kind of actually argued on disability advocates is whether or not like he actually owned that fact or not. Like I was kind of the opinion going into this that he did not own that fact and that he commonly tried to hide the fact that he had a disability. But there is a historian, James Tobin, who argued that he used his disability to his advantage. And he commonly referred to it like himself as an underdog, and he wouldn't like explicitly call out that he didn't have legs because that's a weird thing to say, but like he
couldn't use his legs, use his legs.
Well, okay, yeah,
he had legs.
Yes. He wouldn't commonly like say that out loud, like say, hey, I can't use my legs. Like that would be a weird thing to put in a speech. But I think that this guy's argument is basically that people knew that, and so him painting himself as an underdog, there was kind of an implied disability rights message behind it, you know. But either way, the take home is that physically he could not use his legs. He had them, he could not use them. Okay, and then January 1st, 1929. So it took him 8 years to get back into being a politician. He became governor of New York. And so he was governor of New York during the Great Depression, which started near the end of 1929. So he was not expecting necessarily, he was elected, at least as a governor, not expecting to be passing a bunch of reforms to help people with the Great Depression, but he was in a position to actually do it. And a lot of the programs that you see him put into place when he becomes president for the first time are ones that he had tried in New York and were successful during his couple of years there between his governorship and his first election.
Was he responsible for the mowing down of Hooverville?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it.
I'm gonna
I'm
look
not
that
sure
up.
exactly what you're
Let's
referring to.
let's keep going. I'll look
Yeah,
that
we
up.
might get there. So during the Great Depression, some stats on overall how bad it was to kind of put in perspective. In the U.S., industrial production went down by 46% over the course of the whole thing, and unemployment went up 607%. So that's just raw numbers in the U.S. over the course of the whole depression. It's also the case, I found this interesting when I was doing the research, that it's widely believed that the gold standard is how the Great Depression spread from country to country, because it started in the U.S. with basically a run on the stock market, right? But it's believed that the gold standard is the reason that it spread, because the relative price of gold in the U.S., like, that matters if you're another country, because you have to have somewhere to sell your gold to, theoretically, right? So it affects the price of your gold, and therefore it affects the price of your currency. And also, to kind of go on to that point, every major country that was on the gold standard and was affected by by the depression went off the gold standard. China was on the silver standard at that point, and they were not affected by the depression that much. So that was part of the evidence that that might be the case. I just found that kind of interesting.
Interesting.
One event that happened during the Great Depression that I want to highlight is the bonus army. And Wiggy, this might be somewhat what you're referring to. This is where 43,000 people, including 17,000 World War I veterans, marched on Washington, D.C. And they were effectively World War I veterans that were after their bonuses. There was kind of like a bonus program where they could be paid out. I tried to understand fully how the system works, and I just couldn't parse it. But I mean, it seems like they basically the U.S. government could kind of decide when their bonuses were going to come due, but they would get paid those bonuses eventually. And so effectively, the goal of the Army was to say, well, we're completely destitute. We have no jobs. So please give us the bonus now. And, we're going to march over here as veterans and try to do something about it. But it is interesting that Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time, and Douglas MacArthur deployed 500 infantry, 500 cavalry, 800 policemen, and 6 tanks against them. And I think people died. None of the people died on the U.S. side, but on the bonus army side, there was 93 deaths or something like that, I think. No, sorry, 2 dead and 55 injured. So glad I checked that.
Wow.
That wasn't what I was leaning to, but it's very close.
Yeah,
it's very close. So what I was leaning into was, so during the term of Hoover, there was a place where now the Great Lawn is for Central Park. Okay. That area was actually taken over by homeless during the Great Depression, and they had made shanty towns.
Right.
And there was a giant shanty town, and that's where a lot of the the homeless lived and things like that. And eventually, I can't tell exactly which president was or governor was in charge of
when did it happen?
Setting up the Great Lawn, because they essentially did was got rid of all the homeless people and then put up a giant pretty lawn in the middle of New York. So,
sure.
It was designed by a group that was called Olmsted and Baugh, which is they're designers, but I can't tell exactly who was in charge of that idea.
Well, the fact that in New York especially, a lot of the development that was done, I mean, this happened in many cities, but definitely New York, the development was done in a way that was intentionally anti-homeless and anti-poor. I mean, the fact that Central Park, I mean, I this is just total speculation, but it's very possible that they put Central Park there because there were homeless people there. They started that project basically as an excuse to kick them out. Right.
Well, there was also poor parts of the city that were there as well. Like, so
Sure.
it wasn't just like the homeless shanties. There were also poor neighborhoods that were there.
Right.
That they also just decimated the area, took the land and decimated the area and created, like, that's what Central Park is built on right now. It's just like depression and like, that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess you could say, like, us living today, I think we get way more of a benefit out of Central Park than, than the cost. But, like, I mean, at the time, that's pretty ridiculous. Like, I mean, it's kind of honestly easy to say that the cost is way too high if you're having to take people out of their homes. Yeah. But I mean, that's really you could do a whole episode on that easily, on just times that this has been done. I mean, there's like the Arch in Missouri, like I think that's a famous one, and I'm sure other monuments and various things have been built specifically to give developers an excuse to kick a bunch of people out of their homes. Okay, so now we can get into the stuff that's actually related to FDR as president. So the very first time he wins is the 1932 presidential election. So this is the first presidential election since the Great Depression started. Hoover was running as an incumbent, and obviously, it's pretty clear to see that he was going to lose, right? Like, but I mean, it was one of those situations where they didn't want to put somebody else in there because probably nobody else wanted they didn't want like an automatic loss on their ticket either, right? Like, any Republican wouldn't want to run and knowing that it's going to be a blowout, basically, right?
Right.
So Hoover runs. He loses almost all states, and it's also a congressional blowout too. There were before this race in 1932, it was roughly even in Congress. After the race, the Democrats had gained 97 seats, and the Republicans had lost 101 seats. Those other 4 seats went to like some kind of like tiny little socialist party. And effectively, at the end of this congressional race, the Democrats had 313 seats in Congress, and the Republicans had 117. So pretty ridiculously unbalanced.
Wow.
The FDR's running mate. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
No, I didn't have anything. I was just saying, wow, that's a big swing.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah. So FDR's running mate is named John Nance Garner, who's nicknamed Cactus Jack. And he is from, and I think this is an important thing to talk about. FDR is from the Northern Democratic Coalition. And I think we talked about this in a previous episode, but effectively, the Democrats had been running slavery and all that stuff in the 1800s. Like, they were the party of slaveholders, and that eventually they were the party of the large agricultural, sharecroppers or whatever in the South, right? They were the rich people in the South, so they were the slavery party. But because up north, the Republicans, like, they were the party that was in power, they were the party that all the money went to. And so whenever people wanted to challenge that money, they would run on the Democratic ticket, even in the North, right? Even though that was effectively associating with the slaveholders in the South. And the reason that kind of worked is because there just weren't all that many Black people in the North. Like, it sort of worked to basically, I mean, there were a lot, but there was not as many as in the South. And so it was like, it didn't matter as much to the people in the North that they were kind of marrying themselves to effectively a like large landowning white people party in the South. They just wanted to be able to beat the Republicans. So they would run onto the Democratic ticket, right? And so FDR was kind of the turning point where that coalition flipped, and the Northern Democrats became more powerful than the Southern Democrats, right? And that's why John Nance Garner, he's from Texas, and he gets put on FDR's ticket basically as a almost like counterweight, kind of, right? So he famously had a quote that said that the vice presidency is not worth a bucket of warm piss.
Nice. That feels like
which is yeah, it's complete. Well, I think that it's true depending on how the president decides to use the vice president.
Right.
Like Al Gore was used very effectively by Bill Clinton. Like, very effectively. He was constantly out of the country talking to other foreign leaders and doing all that stuff on Clinton's behalf. So I think it does depend on how it's used.
Right.
And how that relationship is. But today, like,
two different coalitions, like,
yeah.
That at that point, you're not even talking about a subordinate. You're talking about an adversary to some degree.
Sure.
Yeah. And if we equate that to today,
finish that.
Go ahead, Joe. I was just gonna say, if we equate that to today, that Harris is literally useless. Like not even used by the party. Like,
I was gonna say that, like, in this specific moment, the vice president seems pretty important, honestly, because there is like every chance that our president will die, either one of them in their term.
Sure.
There's a pretty good chance that
Swift Breeze
will become very important.
Yeah, for sure.
And spoilers for our story, but that's also the case for FDR, right?
Right.
Eventually, who his vice president does matter a lot. But as poor Cactus Jack, though, for him, he was vice president for the first 2 terms of FDR, and he really did not enjoy himself. I don't think he was pretty much shut out of everything. He was the vice president is always the leader of the House of Representatives, right? So he was that, and I know that he did like have some input in some of the bills that were written, but I don't know how much his input actually mattered.
Well, most people don't know who he is, so not very much.
Yeah. So the next section I have is the first 100 days, which I think is pretty interesting. Just if you imagine, like, if anything like this were to happen today, it's really hard to even fathom how much changed within the first 100 days of FDR.
And that's still a metric that people use to judge a presidency, not like even today.
Yeah.
So
that Biden has said, like, he's the most progressive president since FDR. Whether that's true or not is another question, but he is excluding FDR. He's basically saying, like, FDR is more progressive than me, right? Inherently by saying that, right? The very first thing that he does is he passes the Emergency Banking Act, and before that, even on March 4th, which is his first day, he declares a banking holiday until the banks can be stabilized. So he basically does something that I think that presidents had been doing, including Hoover had been doing this, which is just basically declare long banking holidays when they're trying to figure something out. And so he did that too. And then he passed on March 9th, he passed the Emergency Banking Act, which it has something very similar to the modern FDIC, where deposits are insured. And within 2 weeks, people had put in half of the money that they withdrew during the Depression. So they didn't, contrary to popular belief, like, people didn't take out all their money because they weren't allowed to. Like, when there was a run on the banks, people got out as much as they could, but eventually they kind of just shut stuff down and, like, didn't let people take their money out anymore because there was no money to give them. Because that's how money worked back then. Like, you had to actually have some. And so, effectively, though, with FDR's going into office and passing this act really fast, people had confidence in the banks again, and the fact that he, decided to insure deposits, right? That helped a lot. So on March 20th, he passed the Economy Act, which cut a bunch of federal salaries in an attempt to balance the budget. And it cut spending programs too. And a lot of people think that probably that made the Great Depression worse. But he had been running on a balanced budget. So I think he basically wanted to do it. And I think back then when people said they wanted to balance the budget, they actually did. So he was going to do it if he said he was going to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to run back then, if you wanted, there was no limits, right? Like, say he's like, I got to get in here, do all the things that I promised. If it all falls apart later and we change it later, we change it later. But I can say, I fulfilled my promises. I don't lie to you. Like, this is who I am. Vote for me. Like,
exactly. And speaking of which, the next thing he did on March 21st was roll back prohibition a bit. So prohibition was still active at this time. And I don't know when it was fully rolled back. It was probably during FDR. I didn't include that in my research, but he rolled back on March 21st, his first 100 days, less than first 20 days in office. He decided to allow the sale of beer and wine up to 3.2%. So that could be sold everywhere in the U.S.
Wine and light beer.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the idea of rolling back prohibition, one of the reasons that at least they claimed they wanted to do it was to stimulate the economy, right? So allowing some beer and wine to be sold really helped a lot.
I think that he also, in one of his speeches, he also made the claim that, if I'm remembering this correctly, he also wanted to make the claim that, which is true to an extent, that if you have hardship, you also have to have the ability to remove some stress.
Sure.
And so, and for like the good of the populace, from like a social, like what's that called? Social. They didn't have
welfare.
No, they didn't use the same term back then.
Let's just say social.
What's that called? Yeah, it's like like for the social good, like for stress levels, they need to be able to like release some of that, and being able to add something like that to the economy would also spur the economy, because there would be, it's a luxury good, right? And a luxury good is really good for an economy.
It's a good that people like to leave their houses to go purchase, So, I mean, I guess back at that time, people had to leave their houses to purchase literally anything. But I mean, that was like a good that people would go and, go to a place that's just for that, and just go there to purchase that, right? So, they could reopen bars and stuff that had been totally shuttered by the prohibition.
Well, he was also, and also with him being the governor of New York, he also understood that it was the mafia that was doing the behind the scenes running of alcohol while there was prohibition. So he's also sticking it to the mafia that was giving him problems when he was governor.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, not only sticking it to the mafia, but literally just reclaiming some profits from them.
Yeah, I mean, and crooked cops. So like he's getting he's hitting lots of stones with that one.
So on March 31st, he founded the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was one of his jobs programs. And they were kind of in charge of like infrastructure, but not, I mean, they would do like bridges and stuff potentially. They did a lot of environmentalism, like forests and like erosion, floods, like that kind of stuff. Building infrastructure to effectively do conservation of natural resources, and also some improvement of resources that were just used for commercial purposes like bridges and what have you. The Civilian Conservation Corps started out desegregated in the north, but eventually it became segregated throughout the entire country. So that was one stain on FDR's record, I guess, right? Ideally, he would have been able to keep that thing segregated, or desegregated everywhere, right? But I mean, I would say that probably the Democrats in the South, I mean, probably what he would say at least, was that the Democrats in the South were too powerful to make that happen. So May 12th, he passes FERA, which is another jobs program. It's a little bit more broad. It also includes the arts. So to pay writers and painters and stuff who are out of work. Also on May 12th, he passes a big farm subsidies and farm credit bill. That's when, I'm not sure if this is exactly when it started, but it really did put into this swing, like basically the U.S. government paying farmers to not make stuff, so that they could control the price of goods a little bit more. On May 18th, he founds the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is another famous jobs program of his. It's a publicly run utility company, and it's the 6th largest in the U.S. still today. A lot of places have. Jeff, is your power through the Tennessee Valley Authority?
I'm not positive.
Okay. I mean, I know that they operate near you, if not in your city, but it still existed today. It's the 6th largest one in the U.S. And what I found interesting doing the research is that apparently it's a government-run corporation. It is not a government office. It's run like a corporation, but the U.S. government just happens to own it. On May 27th, he establishes the SEC. Basically, he creates this what was called the Securities Act to regulate stocks. So that was needed, to kind of solve some of the problems that had caused the Great Depression in the first place.
Let me jump in real quick. So, Jeff, it goes all the way down to halfway between where you are and where Huntsville is.
Okay, so now we get down to where we are.
It covers the top, it doesn't quite make it down to where you are. It covers the top third of wherever the fuck you are.
Birmingham
state is Atlanta, whatever the fuck.
Alabama.
Alabama.
Yeah.
I don't fucking know. I'm tired, guys. I'm sorry. I'm tired today.
That's perfectly fine.
Definitely a state. I'm gonna stick with it. It's definitely a state. I believe it with all my heart.
Once we get 75 states, I think they'll have to make Atlanta one. It's big enough.
Thank you for supporting me, Rab.
Jacksonville will be its own state too.
Yeah. Let's do this.
we should start a change.org position to make Wiki right. We could just make Atlanta its own state.
That's a terrible idea. That's a terrible idea. And I'll be the first one to say it, because if I think I'm right all the time, I've done a really good job at trying not to think that I'm right all the time. So don't fluff me up like that.
Sounds good. Well, speaking of fluff, on June 5th, FDR moves off the gold standard. So back to what I was mentioning on that happened in his first 100 days. June 13th, mortgage assistance. June 15th is when he passes Glass-Steagall, which is a famous one because this is where the FDIC was actually established, right? Earlier, it was kind of just like echoes of it. And also Glass-Steagall is something that was recently repealed. They didn't repeal the FDIC, but they repealed the part of it that specifically says that you must keep commercial and investment banking separate. So that basically means that people lending to homeowners and developers and small business owners can't just turn around and put that money into a bunch of speculative stocks, right? That's what Glass-Steagall did. And I believe it was undone under Clinton, but I could be wrong. Was it Obama? I'm not 100% sure. I should find that out.
That's the actual basis of on why it happened a long time before, but it's the basis of why the '08 crash was so bad.
Right.
Because
that's associated with Obama, but it did happen in 1999 under Clinton.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, hopefully nothing bad ever happens again, because I just don't think anybody ever went and put it back in place after it happened, after it caused.
Nope, they sure as fuck didn't.
They just said, we'll quantitative ease harder.
I'm going to say that the next time my wife gets mad at me, I'll be like, stop quantitative easing at me.
I thought you were just going to say that you were going to quantitative ease harder. Like, sorry, honey, I'll quantitative ease harder next time.
Or that works too.
So outside of his first 100 days, in 1935 is when Social Security and the NLRB started. So two famous social welfare programs, Social Security for the, basically as a paycheck after you retired, right?
What year was that?
1935.
I think he's got a follow up to that.
Yeah, I was hoping he would have a follow up soon.
Yeah, I do. So in 1935, the average life expectancy was between 50 and 65 years.
Damn.
So just as an aside, like when that happened, that was the average life expectancy, and I believe the average retirement rate was somewhere around 50, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
So it wasn't meant to give people from the age of 50 to the age of 110, like, to support them throughout 50 years of life. Like,
Sure.
that wasn't the goal there.
It
But
seems like-
also,
It seems like a good time to point out that I am keeping a list of for and against for FDR here, and I put Social Security on the against. That was not a winner for me.
I think it was definitely a winner. Like, they didn't foresee the growth of life expectancy to that range, because up until that point, that was like, even previously, it had not made that big of a jump from the rest of history to where they were. It was really after that point, 50 years later, when that jump actually started happening. So I think it was a good idea. We just never changed anything with it in a meaningful way, and Bush didn't help by taking out 80% of the money to pay for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So,
Right.
which he wasn't supposed to legally be able to do, which is a war crime.
So, Jeff, is that why you have it in your against us, just because it didn't work?
Yeah, that's the only reason.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. Fair enough. I mean, fair enough, definitely. But I would say that maybe we're skipping ahead of, I guess, spoilers for things that happen after the end of my notes. But, like, ultimately, I think the time between FDR and, like, I don't know, maybe all the way up into the 90s was basically government, like, every president and every politician who was elected were like trying to fight against the New Deal and, like, trying to roll it back as much as they could. And so I think all of these things, I mean, the NLRB too, right? When it first started, it had a lot of powers, and it defined unfair labor practices. And when it first started, at least, it was only defining the unfair labor practices that businesses could do to their employees. Eventually, the Taft-Hartley Act was introduced, right? That was later on. And that one redefined it so that not only did it make wildcat strikes illegal, it also made it so that there were unfair labor practices that the employees could do, right? Wildcat strikes being one of those. So they kind of, effectively right there pulled a fast one on, like, the power base of who put FDR in power in the first place, right? After he was gone. And I think Social Security is kind of the same way, like, back to what Wiggy was saying, right? Like, the reason it's so bad today is because people have been working on making it bad. Basically, right? They've been working on trying to, like, undo what was done during this period. But while he was doing this stuff, he was extremely popular. So in 1936, he won a landslide re-election. And this was his second term. What is different about this term is that a conservative coalition formed in 1937 in Congress. The Democrats were still the majority power, and, like, I don't think Republicans had really even gotten that many seats back. But effectively what happened is that a large number of Democrats decided to basically leave FDR's camp and just vote with the Republicans. The ones that didn't like what was happening, the ones that represented those Southern interests, like the very wealthy interests in the South. And so they basically decided to vote with the Republicans to oppose what FDR was trying to do. And this conservative coalition actually held until 1963. So all the way to Lyndon B. Johnson, this was the state of Congress, right? Is that the majority of seats were held by this particular coalition. They didn't always vote the same way. but they did at least have like an agreement that they were against this stuff that FDR was doing. And so in 1937, also FDR had decided to introduce the court packing plan, which I think we talked about in a previous episode. The idea that you would add extra justices to the Supreme Court, because the Constitution doesn't say how many it should have. It just says who has the powers to appoint them and how that process works, right? So what FDR's idea was to basically add one new justice every time someone refused to retire at 70.
That's great. Yes.
So, exactly. I mean, it's so ridiculous when we say it. Like how, I mean, the fact that they was doing that when people refused to retire at 70. I think the justices only started to, like, there was basically a precedent before FDR that justices would always retire when they hit 70, and they started refusing because they didn't want to give him the opportunity to appoint a new judge, basically.
What a millennial solution to that problem. Like it's not, or maybe I should say, what a like late Gen X, early millennial solution to that problem. Like, it's like, okay, like, well, fuck you then. Like, just do the thing. Like,
yeah, basically. I think it was he was thinking that it would kind of maybe make it past that conservative coalition, given the fact that it seems pretty reasonable, right? It had a precedent of people retiring at 70. If the Supreme Court wasn't going to do that, then they were going to add people anyways, right? It ultimately did not pass Congress because FDR was going to have to get that past Congress to actually do it. But it did succeed in scaring the judges enough that they started voting in favor of New Deal legislation more often than not. So it worked. It had the effect that FDR wanted, just not exactly win how he wanted.
Fucking gangster. That's how I'm gonna say that. That was a gangster move.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he in the second term, it was a lot harder for him to just blanket pass stuff. So, like, I didn't do a lot of research on exactly what was passed during that time. I would imagine the stuff that did get passed was more of the same, and they probably had I mean, it would be interesting. I bet what would be really interesting is if I had done some research into what wasn't passed during that time, like what was floated but not passed. But I mean, I guess FDR is probably too smart of a politician to waste too much time on things that he knows he can't get past Congress either. So I'm jumping straight ahead into the 1940 election, where this is where FDR's running mate changed. And in another gangster move, what he did was he refused to say if he was going to run or not. So he did not say that he was going to run. And there is a historical precedent going back to George Washington that presidents would only serve for 2 terms. That was what everybody did. They served for 2 terms if they could get them, and then they retired, and then they never ran again. There's no law saying you couldn't do that. And so he did not say he was going to run. And then eventually, Cactus Jack decided he was going to run. He couldn't wait it out any longer. And so that made him not eligible anymore to be a vice president. So that meant that FDR got to have a lot more say over who was his vice president. And he managed to win the convention and have a running mate who was actually to the left of him, I would say, maybe possibly. The guy's name was Henry Wallace. And he was a famous, like, I would say at the very least, like, communist sympathizer. He was eventually fired by Truman for recommending conciliatory policies towards the Soviet Union. He had a public speech where he recommended that the government should do that, and Truman decided to fire him over that. He was at that time, obviously he was not vice president, right? Truman was. Truman was vice president and became president, but he was in government up until that point, right? And the other thing about Henry Wallace is that he actually did have Soviet spies working for him, like actual Soviet spies for sure. Whether he knew that's what they were or not is another question. He might have just been kind of like a dupe. But he certainly was like I would say all of those things put together puts him in many ways to the left of FDR. And it's a very interesting counterfactual to imagine that FDR had died in office, between the 1940 and 1944, right? And on this term, if FDR had died in office, and Henry Wallace was leading the U.S. government during World War II, right? That's a fairly interesting counterfactual, I think.
He also has the name of a president. You can imagine that we had a president named Henry Wallace. Like,
if you told me that, I'd believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're like 37,
two like semi old timey first names, like you could be a guy first name Henry or first name Wallace, like both of those put together. But they're semi old timey, so that helps too.
Like Jim Bob, right? Like President Jim Bob, John Henry.
Yeah. I mean, John Henry, that isn't the president, but is it? I'm pretty sure it's not. But that's one of the guys who worked on the railroad, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you take the S off, and you've got John Quincy Adams.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Or like Thomas Jefferson, even. I mean, Jefferson is somebody's first name many times, and I think honestly, we're probably like correlating things backwards in a way. Like the reason that those were common first names was because they were last names of very famous people.
Right.
Henry Wallace probably didn't inspire a whole lot of Wallaces, but
Wallace and Gromit. That's something.
Yeah, Wallace from Wallace and Gromit. Gromit was actually a Soviet agent.
Yeah.
It's all making sense now.
So obviously the 1940 period is, World War II. Right? World War II begins officially around that time, or I think maybe it already started. When was? I feel like I should know this. We should cut this out.
No, we're keeping it for the
Patreons,
yeah, for the Patreon. They get to see this stuff. This is what you're paying for, folks.
Right. This is your only perk.
So it started World War II. And I better provide the content, right? So World War II started September 1st, 1939. So actually before the election, right? But at that time that the election happened, it wasn't known whether or not the U.S. was going to join. But what the U.S. people did know is that they did still want FDR as their president. He had done a really good job up until that point, according to them. So he got elected in the Democratic primary and then elected in the general election again.
To hearken to just put an aside on this one. So you mentioned like it wasn't really whether or not America was going to get involved in World War II, right? We know that the only reason why we got involved in World War II is because of Pearl Harbor. Like we know that was the people in power at that point could not tell the American people that we would not go to war after we've been attacked on home ground.
Sure.
So, but before that, and I think this was mentioned previously on some of our other episodes on World War II, but not everybody believed that Hitler, like they were okay. The alliance was like okay with Hitler taking over one country and then the second country because he kept saying he'd stop.
Sure. And
they actually liked him because he was doing good things for, or appeared to be doing good things for Germany. He was a stabilizing factor for that region. Even though he was doing terrible things, he was perceived that way from the outside without us knowing what he was doing on the inside necessarily.
Sure.
So America didn't want to get involved. I wish we still had that same philosophy today where we didn't want to get involved in everything all over the world, but we don't.
Right.
But I'll get off that side first. I just wanted to say like that was the thought process that like we don't need to get involved in this. Like
sure.
We don't know that there's horrible things going on, right? Like let's mind our own business.
Well, I do think it's worth maybe spending some time here. And because I don't want to talk too much about what happened during World War I, but the reasons to go in, I think, that's kind of the interesting part of FDR, right? And I mean, you mentioned Pearl Harbor. Like, I do think that was a big thing. I don't think this is true, but I do think there were some people at the time who believed that like Pearl Harbor was an inside job, basically, to get the U.S. in. Because
Oh, sure.
of the fact that it was like, I think that the kind of like the economic justification, right, was that there were so many loans. Like the U.S. was basically selling weapons to both sides until they joined, but the British owed us so much money for those weapons, basically. And this was the justification for World War I too, right? Those loans for World War I weren't even fully repaid, right? And so the U.S. coming in, I think it was a little easier to justify for World War II than it was for World War I. But I think that kind of everybody knew that if the U.S. was going to get in, they were going to, which side they were going to be on, right? And also they knew that the U.S. would eventually come in to back up Britain, who owed all those debts, right? So that they could get repaid one day.
Yeah, I mean, multiple things can be true at the same time.
Yeah,
Like it's not even like maybe we were gonna stay out of it, but we were gonna start giving preferential treatment in the sales, right, to Britain over Germany just because of that same motive, and then all of a sudden we get Pearl Harbor, right? And they're like, okay, well, like we don't have a choice now, like we got to do the thing.
Or maybe there were like secret plans to like declare on Japan before Pearl Harbor happened. The Japanese find out and just go ahead and say like, well, what can we do in the meantime? You know, I mean, everybody, just like everybody knew that the U.S. might have to get involved, everybody knew that the U.S. was probably going to at least focus on knocking Japan out effectively before they, came and invaded Europe, right? Because they had interests in the Pacific, and they also were the only ones that shared that border with the Japanese.
You're muted, bud.
I was muted. That was also at the time where it was either pre-France or it was when France was actually holding the line before Blitzkrieg. So there wasn't a actual great reason for us to go to the European front at that point.
Yeah, that's roughly true. I think the France fell on basically between 9 May and June 22nd of 1940. So yeah, I mean, the time when FDR was elected, I guess that would have already happened. But and then Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. So I mean, I guess.
See, I said I was gonna fuck up. I was gonna fuck these moments up. I said I was gonna do that. So
yep.
There we go. There's number probably 7 now.
The historical revision that Jeff would have to do to make it so that we all got our dates right all the time, I think, is too extreme.
I'm never going to do that. No.
Yeah, don't ever do that. Don't ever do that.
Know how dumb we are.
I need the world to keep me honest. Like, I need the world to keep me honest.
Yep, definitely. Well, speaking of honesty, the American people trust FDR again in 1944, and that's his final term. So, I mean, unless you guys have more to say about FDR in World War II.
Well, there was the camps. Did we talk enough about the camps?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's worth mentioning again. Pearl Harbor, like people, actually, I was going to mention that earlier when you talked about people not knowing what was happening in Germany. I think it was more that people like didn't care or like they didn't fully understand the atrocity until after the fact. But I think they did have some sense because people did at the time compare what was happening that FDR was doing to what Hitler was doing with the Jews. Like, so that comparison was made. So clearly some people did have that insight to see that.
There was also a fuck ton of external propaganda going on at that time. Like both the Soviet Union and Germany had propagandists in the US that were spreading fake knowledge to the populace to try to get them to sway public opinions one way or the other. Like they were both very much involved in the spy game. Like the spy game was gigantic during that period in time, and propaganda, like that's really literally when like we started heavily using the word propaganda was right after World War II.
Yeah, and I guess it makes perfect sense that will be going on because, I mean, if the Germany could convince the U.S. to stay out for a little bit longer or to join on their side, I mean, it was pretty unlikely that they were ever going to actually join on their side. But if the U.S. had sit out the entire war, that would be basically the same from the Germans' perspective as them joining. Like that's good enough if they were able to sit out and make them sit out the entire war. And maybe no one ever thought that that's what they're going to be able to achieve, but like, if they could keep them out for another 2 years, like that might be enough to end it, So
well, it would be enough for them to take the majority of their western side forces and move them up towards Russia to hold Russia off.
Right.
I think that's what they were counting on when they were using the Blitzkrieg method to push their way through Europe. So had we stayed out of it, like we stayed out of it as long as we could, and the reason why we stayed out of it it took us another couple of years before we actually jumped in, but that's because we had like all of our manufacturing went to war items, like wives were sitting at their kitchen tables and creating like stuffing bullets with gunpowder. Like my grandmother did that.
Sure.
Like that was the entirety of the economy at that point. So. But yeah, it did take a little extra time for us to get in right after Pearl Harbor. But there was a moment of we can't stay out of this any longer.
Sure.
We've got to go.
Yeah. And I guess that is one thing interesting thing that FDR kind of had going for him at this point is that the World War II was basically a natural stimulus to the economy. And it really was the only time that that was the point where we fully recovered from the Great Depression, finally. I mean, it was effectively like he didn't have as much of an overwhelming majority in Congress anymore, but everybody in Congress supported like the U.S. patriotism, right? So by the time he was able to get into the war, it was easy to pass the jobs programs because those jobs were, like you said, the woman making bullets at home and, getting paid to ship those off, right? And so that everybody supported that and everybody supported the massive government spending that was needed to support the war effort, right? Anything else on World War II with him?
And there goes the beginning of the American war machine and all that stuff that we bitch about today. That's the beginning of it.
True. I would say that FDR isn't really somebody who can be directly blamed for that.
I'm just saying that's the origin.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, we have never gone off of the World War II war economy. Like that, they had the choice after World War I to roll back the war economy, and they did partially. They didn't do it fully because I think a lot of people understood that there was going to be a repeat, right? But after World War II, like effectively, there wasn't really any rollback of the war economy. I mean, they did, like maybe they transitioned some of those jobs. Yeah.
It got moved into NASA.
Yeah, exactly. They kept the spending up, and they kept the production up, and they kept the like productivity up. Honestly, like the amount that people needed to put into the economy to make things work. That never really ratcheted back down. Well, I mean, this is kind of where the story ends ultimately, right? Because FDR does win again in 1944 for his fourth term. But this time at the convention, people are like 99% sure that he's going to die, effectively. So they make his vice president matter a lot again. And so they pick a bureaucrat, a cog in the Democratic machine from the South, of course, Harry Truman. And that's the guy who is in there when FDR finally kicks it in 1945. He made it about a year into his term. And he died from having obscenely high blood pressure. I should get the numbers on that real quick.
Yeah, it was
it's really
nuts.
funny. I mean, not to say that it's really funny for somebody to have high blood pressure.
I mean, but in hindsight, when we're talking about a president who just would not give up, like,
yeah,
it's pretty funny.
Yeah. So at the time of his death,
This is pre-modern medicine. Remember, people die at the age of 60 here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. So the last time it was measured, it looks like it was 260 over 150.
What the fuck?
He was just having a stroke for months. Before he died, he was just having one continuous stroke for 5 months.
Wow. That's
so yeah,
crazy.
he's one of those classic cases of he's a classic case of too much going on for one person and their head just explodes. I think that seems like something that happens with historical figures from time to time that end up doing a lot. One example I would say is
Churchill.
Churchill, also Lenin.
Yeah.
I mean, his head exploded eventually.
Yeah.
And I think these people, they're very
McConnell's head's exploded. It just stopped working all of a sudden. You can't.
There were a couple times during the debate
Biden
last week where it seemed like that happened.
Yeah,
okay.
It's just what happens when you're in that machine for too long. It just
Yep.
You get
I've got some
brain diabetes.
I've got some final questions here.
Sure,
was it FDR or Truman the one who would dress in drag in private?
I think that might have been a general, actually.
There was a president who would, I'm sure.
I'm pretty sure it was Truman.
Did President Truman really have gender identity issues? Apparently, This was in Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That Truman used to pretend to be a girl, or that actually the Truman's mother claimed he was supposed to be a girl. Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
He was only 5'4".
So it was Truman, not FDR.
Was he taller than Ross Perot?
Yeah. Although you would think that being in a wheelchair, being in a dress, might actually help a lot with that. I don't know.
Yeah, you would think so. Yeah.
There was another president that was so fat they had to give him a custom bathtub. I don't remember which one
that was.
Taft.
Taft. Yeah.
It was Taft. Yeah. Okay, well, I have my final score on the good versus bad for FDR here then.
Wait. Before you give this a score, were you planning on making, if he dressed up in a dress, were you planning on making that a point for him?
Yeah, I actually ended up, it was going to be a full point. I actually get him a half point for picking Truman as his vice president because of that. So it's 9.5 points for, 7 points against. We're going to go ahead and say that FDR was an okay president. Yeah. Jeff's seal of approval.
Well, if so says Jeff, so says God. That's what I think that's a saying.
I want to know why we also don't know anything about Jeff's made up point system. It's completely arbitrary. As to what anything means. He could have taken how many did you take off for the Japanese internment camps?
That was worth 3 points. That was the worth more points than anything else on the list. Yeah. Yeah, that was 3 points. Yeah.
Because if you weighted everything equally, I think we got a problem there.
No, I did not. This was a very fair and balanced list, I have to say. As an impartial person who created this very balanced list of reasons while listening to this, I'd say that it's good. Don't question my authority.
You should edit it into the video so that people on Patreon can see it.
Yeah, you can see all the spelling mistakes and everything right there. Okay. That's all you get. You guys don't get to analyze that.
I can't see your video.
You have to go back and watch
your video's been kind of fuzzy.
You two both have to pay for the Patreon account so you can go in and watch this video. Okay? You don't get freebies.
That includes seeing your face this whole time, basically.
Yeah.
It must because your video's been very fuzzy for us. So at least
it's gonna upload fine. My internet's just been shit all night, but it'll upload fine. So
yeah, fair enough. I think that's also the reason that you've been kind of lagging and we've been talking over you.
Yeah, that's why I haven't been talking as much. I could tell that I was lagging for you guys. So
all right, well, on that note,
visit the Patreon if you want to see all of these things.
if you want to see all of our countless errors over this episode, the ones that Jeff doesn't leave in, make sure to like and subscribe and pay us $5 to see that. I guess speaking of jobs programs, join our Patreon.
That's right.
And that was FDR, everybody. Thanks for hanging out.
Bye, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Bye.